In the autumn of 1864, Tennessee was a land trembling under the weight of war. The rolling hills of Sumner County, once lush with wheat and tobacco, had become a corridor of fear. Soldiers moved like shadows across the land, Confederate raiders, Union patrols, and desperate deserters who owed allegiance to no one. And in the middle of this uncertain world stood Ashford Farm, a sprawling estate with fields stretching into the mist, its white columned house visible like a lonely sentinel against the distant tree line. In 1864, Tennessee was not just a state caught in the middle of a brutal conflict. It was a fractured land where every field, farmhouse, and river crossing carried the scars of war. The Civil War had torn through its soil like a storm that refused to pass, leaving behind not only battlefields but also countless small tragedies, whispers of betrayal, and an air of constant uncertainty. The great battles of Shiloh, Stones River, and Chickamauga were already carved into memory. But for the people living on the farms and in the towns scattered across the countryside, the war was never something distant. It was in their barns when soldiers took livestock, in their kitchens when armed men demanded food, and at their doors when loyalty was questioned. By the fall of 1864, Tennessee had become one of the most contested states in the nation, a patchwork of Union and Confederate control shifting almost weekly, where authority was enforced less by government and more by whoever carried the rifle. For the families of northern Tennessee, every day brought a test of survival. Union patrols roamed the roads while Confederate cavalry cut through the woods, and deserters, men too weary or disillusioned to fight, haunted the land like wolves in human form, preying on isolated farms. Law and order seemed to collapse under the weight of constant military presence, leaving civilians in a state of unending vigilance. A knock at the door after dark could mean conscription, robbery, or worse. People locked their homes not just against strangers, but against neighbors who might turn desperate under hunger or suspicion. The countryside itself bore witness to these tensions. Fences lay broken where armies had passed. Fields went untended because the men were away at war, and houses were stripped bare when occupying soldiers demanded shelter. Crops rotted in some places, while in others they were harvested not for families but for regiments moving through. With every passing month, it became harder for families to separate survival from allegiance, because whichever side they favored, the other would punish them when discovered. Those who leaned Confederate often hid young men from Union patrols, while Unionists quietly aided Northern troops and risked retaliation from guerrillas. The line between right and wrong blurred until only the immediate threat of violence seemed real. This was the atmosphere in which the Ashford family lived. Their farm, a sprawling estate with fertile fields and laborers bound to its upkeep, stood as both a symbol of stability and a target of envy. In a landscape filled with scarcity, any sign of wealth drew eyes. And yet the Ashfords were not alone in their unease. Their neighbors, too, locked away silver spoons and concealed food stores, fearing the day when the war would arrive not with banners and drums, but silently, in the form of raiders or deserters. The war was everywhere and nowhere was safe. It seeped into conversations at church, into the hush of markets, into the very way people glanced at one another with suspicion. Tennessee was not merely a battleground. It was a crucible, pressing its civilians under the invisible weight of dread, uncertainty, and the ever-present knowledge that even the quietest night could erupt into sudden violence. The Ashford family stood apart in their corner of Tennessee, not only because of the size of their land, but also because of the weight their name carried. Generations of Ashfords had worked the soil, built the great white-columned house that commanded the valley, and overseen the fields that stretched down toward the river. They were seen as people of means, but also of influence, the kind of family whose word could sway a church vote or whose presence at a gathering lent it a certain authority. Yet behind the image of prosperity and stability, there lingered the same unease that haunted every household in 1864. Thomas Ashford, the patriarch, was a man carved by discipline. Accounts from neighbors describe him as stern, deliberate, and not easily swayed by emotion. He had fought once in younger years during skirmishes with native tribes to the west, and though he was no longer a soldier, he carried himself with the authority of one. His voice was said to carry across the fields, commanding both his own children and the enslaved workers with an edge that left little room for defiance. To some, he was the embodiment of Southern resolve, a man unwilling to bend even as the war closed in. To others, he was cold, a figure whose pride might one day become a weakness. His wife Eleanor was a different presence altogether. Those who remembered her spoke of her quiet elegance, a woman who moved softly through her home, tending to her children with a devotion that seemed to shield them from the world outside. Unlike Thomas, she was approachable, known for offering bread or shelter to those in need, though always within the limits of propriety. Yet there was a nervousness about her in the final year of the war, as if she sensed that the world they had built was balancing on the edge of collapse. It is said she often stood on the veranda at dusk, gazing toward the pike where riders came and went, her hands clasped as though in prayer. Their children, too, were part of the fabric of local life. 2 sons, one nearing manhood and another still in his school years, helped about the farm but dreamed beyond it. The eldest was rumored to have spoken openly of wanting to join the fight, though his father forbade it, insisting that their duty was to protect the homestead. Their youngest, a daughter of just 10, was often seen with her mother in town. A figure of innocence in a world growing more hostile by the day. The Ashford estate was sustained not only by its family, but by the labor of those bound to it. Enslaved men and women worked the fields, tended the animals, and maintained the household. Their lives were lived in the shadow of the Ashfords' authority, yet whispers suggested discontent had begun to grow more visible as the war dragged on and the promise of freedom spread from camp to camp. Union soldiers in Tennessee often encouraged enslaved workers to flee toward their lines, and some Ashford neighbors had already lost entire workforces overnight. It was a tension that Thomas could not ignore, even as he tightened his grip on the routines of the farm. Beneath the surface of their daily life, supper in the grand dining room, Sunday visits to the local church, the sounds of horses in the stables, there existed a fragile balance. The Ashfords presented themselves as strong, proud landowners unshaken by the war. But inside the walls of their home, fears simmered. Of deserters who might storm the house, of soldiers demanding allegiance, of the very people who worked their land slipping away into the night. Theirs was a family bound by duty and appearances, yet increasingly haunted by the shadows closing in around them. The night of October 17, 1864, began with a strange stillness that settled over the valley like a warning. Autumn air carried the faint smell of wood smoke from scattered homesteads, and a heavy mist curled across the low fields, dimming the moonlight to a pale, ghostly glow. Those who later tried to recall the evening said the land felt unnatural, as if the usual rhythms of farm life had paused, the distant barking of dogs muted, the night insects subdued. At the Ashford estate, lamps glowed faintly through the windows, their light softened by curtains that swayed with the draft. Inside, the family prepared for supper, their voices rising and falling in the familiar patterns of domestic routine. It was to be, by all outward appearances, an ordinary night, yet ordinary it would not remain. Sometime after dark, the house fell silent, its lanterns extinguished, its halls emptied of the sounds of life. When morning came, neighbors passing along the pike saw the gate hanging open as though left unattended in haste. A horse grazed untethered by the fence, its saddle still strapped, as if the rider had dismounted and never returned. The front door of the great house stood ajar, swaying slightly with the wind. What greeted those who entered was not a scene of violence, but one of interruption. The table had been set for supper with plates, bread, and boiled vegetables arranged neatly, though none of it touched. A pitcher of water rested half empty, and beside the hearth lay a shawl belonging to Eleanor Ashford, folded carelessly as though dropped in sudden movement. The upstairs rooms told a similar story. Beds had been turned down, but the sheets were smooth, unslept in. In the children's quarters, dolls were scattered near a chair, their play unfinished, abandoned mid-moment. Not a window was broken, not a lock forced. It was as if life itself had simply drained from the house, leaving its shell intact. Outside, the grounds revealed the first hints of disturbance. Near the barn, boot prints pressed deep into the damp soil, leading both toward and away from the house in overlapping confusion. Some claimed the marks belonged to soldiers, the heels and soles distinct from the worn shoes of farmers or laborers. In one patch of mud, wagon tracks could be traced heading north, their ruts shallow but unmistakable. Yet the barn doors stood closed, the animals still in their stalls, unmolested. Even the chickens clucked quietly in their coop, untouched by the night's mystery. The quarters that had once housed the enslaved workers were found deserted. Beds empty, tools laid aside, fires in their hearths cold. Whether they had fled willingly into the night or been driven away alongside the Ashford family became an immediate question. No one could say for certain, and the silence of the farm seemed to deepen that uncertainty. The absence was the most chilling detail. No bodies, no cries for help remembered, no sound of struggle carried on the wind. In the span of a single night, an entire household, family, children, and workers alike, had vanished. To the neighbors standing in the doorway of the grand house, gazing at the untouched supper and the empty rooms, the effect was deeply unsettling. It was not the sight of violence that struck them, but the unnerving impression that the Ashfords had been erased, as though swallowed whole by the darkness that hung over Tennessee in that season of war. In the days following the discovery of the empty Ashford home, attention turned to the few clues scattered across the farm, fragments of a story that refused to reveal its ending. The first and most striking was the supper table, carefully arranged yet untouched, a tableau frozen in time. To neighbors who stood staring at the uneaten bread, the cooled meat, and the pitcher of water resting on the sideboard, it spoke of sudden interruption. Families might go hungry during wartime, but they did not abandon food already on the table, unless something urgent, something pressing, forced them away. It was a detail that lingered in every retelling, a symbol of how abruptly the night had turned. Near the hearth, Eleanor's shawl carried its own quiet weight. It was not folded nor hung as it might have been with care, but left dropped, its edge brushing the floorboards. The image of the lady of the house discarding it so hastily unsettled those who saw it. Some suggested she had been startled, rising quickly, perhaps to greet unexpected visitors at the door. Others whispered she might have fled in alarm, leaving it behind in her haste. For a family known for their formality and order, the shawl was more than cloth. It was an echo of disorder, a sign that something had gone awry. Outside the walls of the home, the evidence grew stranger. The ground near the barn told of many feet moving in the dark. Boot prints, some large and deep, others smaller and lighter, were pressed into the mud, overlapping as though a group had stood waiting, shifting restlessly. Their direction was unclear, some leading toward the house, others pointing away, creating a tangle that no one could unravel with certainty. Among these marks, several claimed to see imprints that did not belong to standard farm shoes, patterns more consistent with military issue. If true, the presence of soldiers would not have been unusual in wartime Tennessee, but whether they had come under orders or as marauders became the central question. Adding to the mystery were the wagon tracks discovered along the northern edge of the property. The ruts were shallow, suggesting a light load but fresh enough to raise suspicion that some vehicle had departed in the night. The tracks led toward the main road but faded quickly into harder ground, leaving no clear trail for pursuers. Did the wagon carry the family away under duress, or did it serve as a vessel for their captors? No one could decide. Equally perplexing was the absence of personal belongings. Jewelry, coins, and household valuables remained untouched, as though robbery had not been the motive. Even the livestock, a resource in high demand during the war, stood unmolested in their pens. It was as if whoever had come was interested not in possessions but in people. Finally, the deserted slave quarters added another layer of unease. Beds were found empty, cooking fires extinguished, tools laid aside mid-use. It was impossible to determine whether the enslaved workers had escaped under their own will, seeking freedom under cover of darkness, or whether they too had been swept up in the disappearance. For some in the community, their absence was interpreted as complicity, a sign of rebellion. For others, it deepened the tragedy, suggesting that an entire human community had been erased in one motion. These fragments, an untouched meal, a shawl by the fire, confused boot prints, vanishing wagon tracks, and abandoned quarters were all that remained to reconstruct the night's events. They spoke in half-sentences, tantalizing with possibility, but none gave answers. Instead, they formed a puzzle whose pieces did not align, each detail adding to the sense that the Ashfords' vanishing was not the work of chance, but of some deliberate and unsettling design. In the absence of answers, suspicion took root in the valley with frightening speed. War had made everyone wary, and when an entire family and household disappeared without trace, the imagination of the community filled the void with rumor and fear. Each neighbor, Each passerby, each soldier stationed nearby carried their own theory, and with every telling the mystery deepened. Some were quick to point the finger at Union cavalry. Tennessee had seen its fair share of midnight raids, where blue-coated soldiers rode hard through the countryside, taking food, animals, and even men accused of aiding the Confederacy. A patrol could have arrived at the Ashford gates in the dead of night, demanding loyalty or retribution. The wagon tracks found near the property, along with the boot prints some believed to be of military design, seemed to lend weight to this suspicion. But there was a flaw. When Union forces raided, they rarely left valuables untouched. Silverware, furniture, even family heirlooms often vanished along with the people. At Ashford Farm, however, everything of worth had been left behind, suggesting a different hand at work. Others argued the culprits were Confederate deserters, hungry, disillusioned men who had slipped away from their regiments and now prowled the countryside like bandits. Such men were known to descend upon isolated farms, stealing livestock and supplies, sometimes murdering those who resisted. Neighbors recalled hearing hoofbeats on the pike days before the disappearance, and some swore that unfamiliar faces had been seen loitering near the river. Yet again, the theory faltered. Deserters were opportunists, and like raiding troops, they usually left a trail of destruction behind them. At Ashford Farm, the quiet order of the house stood in eerie contradiction. The most controversial suspicion centered on the enslaved workers themselves. With freedom spreading through Tennessee in the wake of advancing Union lines, whispers of escape and rebellion traveled quickly among the quarters of every estate. It was not unheard of for entire groups to vanish in the night, making their way northward through secret paths and river crossings. Could the Ashfords' own workers have risen against them, taken their chance at liberation and fled, perhaps carrying the family with them to mask their tracks? Some in the community seized on this explanation, eager to believe in the possibility of insurrection. Yet no proof emerged. No sightings of the Ashfords nor of their servants were ever confirmed along the known escape routes. It remained, like the other theories, only conjecture. Beyond these possibilities, darker and more personal whispers began to circulate. Old resentments, feuds over land boundaries, and jealousies hidden beneath polite society all resurfaced in the vacuum of certainty. The Ashfords had been respected, yes, but also envied. Their influence, their wealth, and their rigid authority had earned them quiet enemies. Was it possible that the disappearance was not the work of armies or strangers at all, but of someone closer, someone who knew the land, the routines, and the weaknesses of the household? Each suspicion deepened the mystery rather than resolved it. The community, already fractured by war, became more divided as fear fed distrust. Families began locking their doors earlier, watching the road with unease, wondering if they too might vanish in the night. The Ashford case had become more than a local tragedy. It was a mirror reflecting the chaos of a land where no one could be certain who to trust, or where danger might come from next. As years turned into decades, the disappearance of the Ashfords and their household refused to fade into obscurity. Instead, it grew into something larger than fact, something woven into the folklore of northern Tennessee. What had once been a case of wartime tragedy became a ghost story passed from generation to generation, a tale parents whispered to children to keep them indoors at night, and travelers recounted by lantern light when the road grew long and lonely. The absence of truth had given space for legend, and the empty farm became its stage. Locals began to speak of strange lantern lights drifting across the abandoned property long after the family was gone. Farmers riding home after dusk claimed they saw a faint glow weaving between the trees, moving too steadily to be mistaken for fireflies, too quiet to belong to living men. Some swore the light hovered at the windows of the Ashford house, as though Eleanor herself still carried her lamp from room to room, tending to children who were no longer there. Others said the glow traveled down the path toward the barn, fading into the mist as though retracing the steps of those who vanished. More chilling still were the sounds. A Union veteran bivouacked near the ruins years after the war, recorded in his diary that he heard the faint cries of children carried on the night wind. He insisted the sound was not of owls or animals, but of human voices, rising and falling in soft distress before disappearing into silence. Generations later, farmhands walking near the old quarters claimed to hear the distant rhythm of footsteps behind them, though the path was empty when they turned. The accounts varied, but their persistence gave the land an air of being watched, as if the vanished had never truly left. Folklore, as it often does, found ways to fill the unanswered questions. Some claimed the Ashfords had been cursed, punished for the weight of their pride or their treatment of those who worked the land. Others believed the family had been led into the woods by phantom soldiers, ghostly raiders replaying the violence of war for eternity. There were even tales of a wagon seen rolling silently down the pike, drawn by horses whose hooves made no sound, with figures seated inside staring blankly ahead, frozen in the moment of their abduction. Children in the surrounding counties grew up daring one another to approach the property on autumn nights, when mist clung low to the ground. They would creep as far as the sagging porch, daring to press their ears against the rotting door, before running back to the road shrieking with laughter and fear. For them, the Ashford Farm was not history but haunted ground, a place where the living and the lost might brush against each other in the shifting dark. Over time, the house itself fell into ruin. The once grand pillars crumbled, the roof sagged inward, and vines clawed their way across the walls. Yet the land carried its legends forward. Stories told in hushed tones at church suppers or around fires on winter nights kept the mystery alive. With each telling, the details shifted, but the core remained. A family gone without trace, a silence that could not be explained, and a lingering presence that seemed to cling to the soil. Folklore turned the Ashfords into more than victims of a vanished night. They became specters in the southern imagination, reminders of how war could not only claim the living, but also bind their shadows to the earth. What unsettled historians and storytellers alike about the Ashford Farm mystery was not simply the disappearance itself, but the way time refused to provide answers. War had ended, the country had stumbled into reconstruction, and new generations tilled the same Tennessee soil. Yet the fate of the Ashfords remained sealed behind silence. No bodies were ever uncovered in shallow graves by the river. No wagon was found overturned on some forgotten road. No whispered confession on a deathbed brought closure. It was as if the family and those bound to their farm had been erased from the record, leaving only an unfinished sentence in the history of the valley. Speculation never ceased, though it hardened with age into a set of competing narratives. Some insisted it was war itself that had claimed them, that they were swept away in the chaos of soldiers and deserters who left nothing behind but mystery. Others leaned toward a more intimate betrayal, a neighbor's envy or an uprising within their own household, events covered so carefully that no trace could be followed. Each version carried weight, yet each remained unproven, balanced in a limbo that only deepened the story's pull. For the community, this lack of resolution became a wound that could not heal. Farms nearby passed from one generation to the next, but the Ashford land stood as a scar. No one who worked its soil could escape the knowledge of what had happened, or rather, what had failed to be explained. The silence grew heavier with each decade, until the mystery itself became more important than the truth ever could have been. It turned into a lens through which people understood their own vulnerability. If a wealthy family with strong walls and many hands could vanish in one night, what protection did anyone truly have? Writers of local histories in the late 19th century began to include the Ashfords among their accounts of wartime suffering, but always as a question rather than a conclusion. They described the uneaten meal, the open gates, the abandoned quarters, but ended with the same refrain: no resolution. By the early 20th century, amateur historians and folklorists were traveling to the site, sketching the ruins and gathering testimonies from aging residents who still remembered hearing of the night when an entire household disappeared. Their notes reflect the frustration of chasing shadows, each account shaped by memory, rumor, and imagination more than fact. Even in modern times, the case continues to draw interest. Some have attempted to apply forensic logic, sifting through maps, military records, and genealogies in search of a missing clue. Yet nothing definitive has emerged. Instead, the Ashford mystery lingers as an open question, a story that refuses the closure so many crave. Its power lies in that refusal. History, after all, is built as much on what we do not know as on what we can prove. The Ashfords' disappearance serves as a reminder that war does not only destroy lives in the heat of battle, it can also erase them in silence, leaving behind only the uneasy weight of absence. The story of the Ashford Farm is more than a tale of one vanished family. It is a reminder of how war devours not only armies, but entire households leaving behind silence where laughter once lived. A supper table left untouched, a shawl abandoned by the fire, children's beds never slept in. These fragments whisper across the centuries, but they do not answer. They ask, and now we turn that question to you. What do you believe truly happened on that October night in 1864? Were the Ashfords carried away by raiders, betrayed from within? Or did the chaos of war mask something darker still? An act buried so deep that history itself recoiled from recording it. Your thoughts, your theories, your voice become part of keeping this story alive. Share them in the comments, because every perspective adds a layer to the mystery. Every observation sharpens the shadows of the past. If you want to walk further into stories like this, true accounts that straddle the line between history and haunting legend, then make sure to subscribe. Each episode will take us deeper into the forgotten corners of our past, where fact and folklore intertwine, and where answers remain just out of reach. The Ashfords are gone, their fate unknowable. But the echoes of their disappearance remain, waiting for us to listen, to question, and to remember. Will you follow those echoes into the next mystery? Subscribe, share your thoughts below, and step with us into the silence history left behind.